Yontif, everybody.
Yontif.
Lishna Tova. The next couple minutes have nothing to do with my feelings about Jackie Mason. Just want to get that out of the way right away. Remember Jackie Mason? Someone saying no? Everyone remembers Jackie Mason. Jackie Mason, the comedian. I once saw him live. I guess we saw him live maybe 25 years ago or something like that, at the Paper Mill Playhouse in New Jersey. And he did a routine about how he did a routine of Jews at the gym, and how we would walk around in fancy sweatsuits, but that we wouldn't sweat. The Gentiles were sweating, and you could hear Jackie Mason doing this bit. The Gentiles would sweat as they were pumping iron, we Jews, Jackie Mason style, but we Jews would strut around like peacocks in sweatsuits, showing off our zipped up sweatsuits and so forth. And I thought, not funny and not true, plus a shanda for the goyim. That joke, I thought, made us look bad in front of the non-Jews in the audience, and it made us feel bad about ourselves, in my opinion. And yet, as I have reflected on this routine, and it stayed with me, honestly, it's pretty much the only thing I remember from that show. It's possible that Jackie Mason was tapping into something relevant. And there's probably a reason why I remember that part of his show and little, if anything else. Maybe the Jews in sweatsuits routine reflected on the uneasy relationship between Jews and power, between Jews and physical power, physical strength. For the way that we mostly have been reared, certainly in the diaspora for centuries, until fairly recently, has emphasized the mind. It's the brain, not the body, that is paramount. Many of us were told that it's best not to earn our livelihoods by doing physical labor. What kind of job is that for a nice Jewish boy? That sort of thing. My great aunt Yetta, when I was in Little League, told me once that if I should happen to connect with the ball when I was batting, that I should not run to first base, but rather walk, so I shouldn't get hurt. Even at 8 years old, I realized absurd, and yet completely absurd. But she was really expressing that old diaspora mentality. Better a clever Jew than a strong Jew. I've also wondered if I so disliked that Jackie Mason joke because it touched upon a personal insecurity or personal anxiety. Perhaps as much as I've always tried to remain fit, as you can plainly see. As much as I have tried to work out and exercise and be fit, I've also wished on some level, or maybe a very overt level, that I wielded greater strength than my frame would allow. I've wondered, truly, if I would be able to protect myself, or my loved ones, or my community, if need be. I have always, since I was a little kid in Sunday school, been acutely aware of our vulnerability as Jews. Schwer zu sein Yid, it's hard to be a Jew. Well, it's certainly hard to be a powerless Jew. In ancient Israel, we enjoyed the prerogatives of autonomy, both political power and physical power. But then came the destruction of the temple, and though we fought boldly, valiantly, bravely to get it back, to get our autonomy back, we lost. And with our exile came disempowerment. I read this great book this summer by Emory University professor Melvin Connor. It's called The Jewish Body. And he wrote, the Jewish body over the centuries went from strong to weak and submissive. And weakness and submission begets trouble. For many generations, we understood this all too well. We were vulnerable, and we knew that the only way that we can get along in our host countries, in the midst of our host populations, was to provide something of value to them. We lived like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and I am hoping and betting that I'm the only rabbi in the high holiday season to allude to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But it's really true. Poor Rudolph was ridiculed until they learned that his difference was useful. His strange mutation, that illuminated nose, could light the way for those Gentile deer. And yes, I said that those deer were Gentiles. Prancer, Blitzen, Dasher, Gentiles. There has been speculation, real scholarly speculation, that Rudolph, whose nose was so bright, was a Jew. You can Google that, it's true. But it wasn't our noses that our host countries found useful. It was rather our access to capital, the fact that we were polyglots, that we spoke multiple languages, and had contacts in other markets by having family and others we knew in other parts of the continent of Europe. That is how we proved our worth. And it was helpful to the Gentile populations, but it was not real power. It was conditional, and it was ephemeral. Things could change, and things did change, for we frequently became convenient targets at which the folk could vent rage and disappointments and frustrations. Blame it on the Jew. Accuse him of ritual murder or well poisoning and throw him down the well. And when that wickedness started brewing, we could hide, but where? We could try to get out of the way, but where? But usually we were stuck, and pogroms ensued. And it's like pogroms, not like pogroms like in Fiddler, that are over at the end of the scene. These were pogroms, rape, murder. There are also kidnappings for ransom, which we paid, and of course, sometimes expulsions. And we were defenseless to the onslaughts. Defenseless, but tragically used to it. We became accustomed to the violence that occurred over the course of centuries and centuries and centuries. We became so accustomed that we invented all sorts of justifications, religious justifications, to justify this violence against us. We told ourselves, or our rabbis or leaders told us, that while we endure the violence now, it's okay because God will rise to our defense someday. Or that the violence is a punishment for our own transgressions. How is that for the victim blaming herself or himself? Or that the violence actually proves our superiority among the goyim, among the nations. They are the brutes and we are the brutalized. They are the benighted and we are the beloved of God. And also, of course, we would always remind ourselves, they had fists and they had torches, but we had Torah, and Torah was our crown, is. Torah learning, the greatest pride for us, and we excelled at that. Erudition was prized. The Rebbe revered. So we would put our minds through intellectual workouts, but not our bodies. We fostered, in the words of scholar Ruth Weiss, W-I-S-S-E, great scholar, we fostered a, quote, veneration of weakness. And our art reflected this as well. You could see it, I've seen these in Haggadot and elsewhere. Jewish men in particular, by our own artists, were rendered as very weak, our bodies curved and sort of effete, pale and skinny. That became the ideal Jewish male figure. And it was in this context, not surprisingly, that the golem myth was created. The golem was that mythical defender of the Jews, created, according to lore, in 16th century Prague. The very idea of the golem makes me sad, honestly. It does. That savior made of clay. It arises from deep within a psyche of our fear. Elie Wiesel has a story called The Golem, and the narrator captures the Jewish state of mind. He says this: As usual, this year promises to be one of punishment. I feel it in every bone of my body. I would not be a Jew if I were not afraid. Honestly, what a lamentable way to live. Our hearts ache for our forebears who endured perpetual fear and periodic violence. But as I mentioned, our ancient glory was so completely different. Biblical heroes who showed strength, physical and political, and were no less heady and spiritual. Abraham was a God-intoxicated leader of armies. What was Moses' first act of Jewish identity? What was his first real act of Jewish identity? It was rising up to kill a cruel, sadistic Egyptian taskmaster. Deborah was a powerful judge and military leader. Samson, fully dedicated to God. He was a mammoth muscle man. David composed the Psalms and killed Goliath and was king, and so forth. But then during our centuries of exile, all those ancient stories, what were they? What were they to us during those centuries? Stories. They were just old stories. And in the meantime, we had to accept victimhood. But even situations that seem absolutely intractable change, or they can change. That, of course, is the theme of this season. With the modern era came modern Zionism, prompted by an insistence, by some at least, that our long epic of humiliation must end. There was an understanding that there was no amount of accommodation and no amount of assimilation, no amount of currying favor, no amount of bribes that we would pay, not even conversion, that would ever actually lead to acceptance or safety for the Jews. Even the emancipation didn't help. Something had to change. And this, I believe, was truly the Great Awakening, late 19th, early 20th century. Theodor Herzl was the central and obviously the most famous catalyst for national pride and for the struggle for autonomy. Many actually hailed Herzl when he'd go from town to town on trains. Many hailed him as the Messiah, really, or as the new Moses. Others, men and women, advocated for Jewish strength in a Jewish homeland. One of those was Max Nordau, not recognized enough. Dr. Max Nordau, Herzl's older, influential lieutenant. At a gathering of the Zionist Congress, Dr. Nordau railed against what he called, referring to us, the nervous weakness of our people, that we just had this inbred nervousness and this weakness, Nordau said. And he declared in his great oratory, because apparently he had great oratory, he said, we must create a Muskeljudentum, a muscular Jewry. And he said, quote, once again become deep-chested, sturdy, and sharp-eyed men. And so throughout Europe, Jews bulked up. They formed athletic clubs. I saw a 1902 photograph of the Berlin Bar Kochba Athletic Club. It shows 9 young men in athletic wear, flanking a Star of David sign, and 3 of those young men are standing on their hands. Those are my kind of Jews. This anticipated the era coming very soon after this of the fiercely proud, even during this time, Jewish boxers who would wear Stars of David on their trunks, Ross, Baer, Levinsky, others. It was an evolution to strength, physical strength, and it was so important, but it was not enough. Our weakness had become so deep-rooted on that continent that we sometimes refer to with, I would say, a very misguided sentimentality as the old country. Not a good country or continent for us. For even as we were awakening to the idea of Jewish strength during that very time, not a few, not dozens, hundreds of pogroms were breaking out in the early years of the 20th century. Hundreds. One of the most famous, Kishinev in 1903. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the poet, visited Kishinev days after the pogrom. In his poem called In the City of Slaughter, which is a long poem, but in that poem, Yes, of course, he condemns the Ukrainian murderers, but he also writes of Jewish men. He excoriates Jewish men who took cover as their sisters and wives and daughters were raped. Bialik refers to the Jewish men as concealed and cowering during the horror. That is a chillingly scathing indictment of powerlessness. That pogrom led directly to the founding of American Jewish Committee, for which I worked for 6 years. Its early leaders here, obviously in America, were wealthy German Jews, and the American culture of advocacy made this group influential, and they flexed as never before another kind of strength, political power on behalf of persecuted Jews in Europe. Meanwhile, the Jews in the Yishuv, pre-state Palestine, pre-state Israel, were finding their strength, and the group HaShomer, which means the guard, were formed. Jews on horseback, with rifles, protecting villages. It was a new Jew rising. There's a really wonderful publicity poster to support the Yishuv financially. It illustrates the new Jewish mindset. At its center of this poster is a young couple, obviously Jewish couple in the land of what was called Palestine. They're tanned, they're strong. He is holding some kind of farm tool. She has a cornucopia of produce from the land, and they're gazing towards the future. Ironically, when that poster was printed and distributed, the foundations for the Shoah were being laid, very same time. A cruel and bitter irony, awful and inexplicable, that as Jewish power arose, 6 million Jews were about to be perished. That just as our enemies exploited our weakness as never before they had, we were becoming stronger. What a confusing incongruity. In any event, our evolution towards strength was profound, and it was rapid, and I would say it was improbable. We Jews like to boast of our many achievements, our inventions, our innovations, and they are many for sure, business, tech, sciences, and so forth, the arts. But I submit that our greatest invention of them all, our greatest invention of anything that we have achieved, has been the reinvention of ourselves. We have gone, and I think that we take it for granted, from political irrelevancy to having confidence in that arena, from physical meekness to having healthy bodies and a Jewish state, and a strong one, for there is no autonomy without power. And no, we don't glorify violence. Jewish law is very clear about this. There are laws as to when violence is justifiable, sometimes necessary, but violence must be carefully considered, reluctantly employed. And may we never venerate violence like we venerated our weakness and meekness. But yes, strength is necessary, and it is nothing to be embarrassed by or squeamish about or trying to explain away. It is necessary. As that scholar from Emory, Melvin Connor, observed in his book, we tried weakness. Oh, how we tried. Strength is better. I have an old book from my dad's collection of books called A Treasury of Jewish Humor. Maybe some of you have that book. A Treasury of Jewish Humor. And it contains a tiny little story, like this big. It's called The Jew in Him. And this little story, a Jewish man wants to convert out. And he's going to do it, but there's one problem. It's not that he's having trouble with the doctrine, Christian doctrine. He's mastered that, smart enough for that. It has to do with one entrenched neurosis. And he tells the minister who's sponsoring him in his conversion, he tells the minister what his problem is, that why he cannot convert and become anything but Jewish. He says, "Oi, I'm still afraid of dogs." I don't like that joke either. The man in the Jew in him, in that story, clearly suffers from a total lack of power. Lacking, I would say, political power, probably seeking greater opportunity, he converts out. Lacking physical courage, he's petrified of dogs. I think it's a pathetic stereotype. That's the Jew in him, that old story back then. But it is not the Jew in us today. We love our dogs, even our gangly, tough mutts, and we advocate for our people, and we appreciate all who keep us safe today, for instance, especially our own guards, who are our own Shomrim here, guards today. And we support the Jewish state Israel and its right to an army. That's the Jew in me, and it's the Jew in you too. On Rosh Hashanah, friends, we acknowledge the potential for change. And so let us today remember what was, which was a tragic powerlessness that lasted and lasted and lasted. And let us celebrate what has changed for the good, for our people and within our people. And let us honor those who truly at a critical point in our history strove and struggled and fought to recreate, to reinvent ourselves, our very Jewish selves, anew. L'Shana Tova.